Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. I'm glad you're here. My name is Katie Valentine, and I am the Director of Online Learning for Disciple Seminary Foundation. We are very pleased to offer this webinar and this very rich and complicated topic, a Blue Christmas, Meaningful Worship in the Face of Reproductive Loss. And we are here with Rich Volz. So Rich, wave and say hi. Great. And Rich is the Assistant Professor of, make sure I get it exactly right, of Preaching and Worship at Union Presbyterian Seminary in Richmond, Virginia. And so we're so happy to welcome him here. Let me just orient everyone to the mechanics of the webinar. You have a chat box that you can type in anytime, and I'll be monitoring the chat box. So just to get started, let's just see where everyone is from. So those of you who are here, just go ahead and type in where in the world you reside. And let's make sure that that's in good working order. So I'm appearing here as DSF, and I reside in Chico, California, although DSF itself is in Claremont, California. The expression's all over. Great. Okay, so Rich is able to type in. So it looks like it's in working order. Oh, great. And so Jenny did us the favor of introducing us to the open questions. And so you'll see at the bottom of your screen that there's a question box, and you can ask questions there. You can answer other people's questions or comment to them. So feel free to use that throughout the webinar. No, that's great. Thank you, Jenny. Feel free to use that throughout the webinar, and I'll monitor that, and we'll pipe in with questions whenever it seems appropriate, and kind of field those to Rich. So our topic today is Blue Christmas, Meaningful Worship in the Face of Reproductive Loss. And we thought that December, as we're facing the Advent and moving into the Advent Christmas seasons, this would be particularly appropriate. So I'm going to turn off my video, and Rich, turn it over to you. And welcome. Thank you very much for being here.
Thanks for having me, and thanks
great
to you
question.
for joining
this seems like a great
tonight. Especially here on a Monday night and at the beginning of a pretty busy season, both personally and in the life of the church for lots of us. So thanks for taking the time out to be here with us. So I really want to cover four things tonight, four major things. And so Katie, if you'll go ahead and advance to that first slide. We'll talk a little bit about my story. And why not my story matters, although I think it does, but why this topic matters for those of us who spend our time preaching and planning worship in churches, or if we sit in the pews on Sundays or wherever that time or place may be. And then we'll think about how preaching and worship function as pastoral care. You may often think of pastoral care as something that happens one-on-one, over coffee or in the pastor's office or with a counselor. But I think preaching and worship function as pastoral care as well. And we'll uncover some of the dimensions of that in relation to this topic. And then third, we'll cover the biblical and theological pitfalls associated with reproductive loss. If we're talking about bringing that to bear in preaching and in worship, we want to be really attentive to what kinds of biblical and theological complexities exist and come along with talking about this topic, to be prepared to do that responsibly and to do it well, to do it with sensitivity. And then finally, as we wrap up tonight, we'll talk about how to plan some meaningful worship experiences, especially around Advent and Christmas. Give some tips and tricks, direct you in some places to go to think about planning services. And so as we begin tonight, I recognize that this topic is not at all easy. It's not at all easy for me to talk about as much as I've talked about it and written about it. And so I realize that this might bring up a mixture of emotions for lots of us, especially in this Advent season, especially as we look toward the sort of Christmas creep that's upon us. Whether that's you or others in your family, those you know in your congregation. And so I invite you to sort of just keep them in mind tonight, whether that's you or the people around you. And I invite you to sort of sit in those feelings that get brought up for you in whatever way you need to in our time together, whether you need to kind of duck out for a moment in the webinar and duck back in, or if you can stay present with us. I understand that many of us are all over the map in terms of the kinds of feelings and experiences that might bring up. So I thought we might just take about 10-15 seconds to bring ourselves to some stillness and to silence. And I'll conclude that time of centering with a brief prayer. So why don't we join together in silence for a moment. Gracious God, bring us to an awareness of your presence, that we might focus and refocus our ministries and our entire beings to bring your healing and your wholeness more fully into the world. Amen. So I want to start as well with a disclaimer. When I talk about reproductive loss and I talk about adoption as well, though we won't do that tonight, I want to recognize a few things just from the very beginning. And the first being that I recognize that my story is not the only story when we're talking about reproductive loss. And so I realize that I speak from a particular perspective, and that's a cisgendered heterosexual male. And I realize that when I talk about reproductive loss, I don't do that in the way that others might. I don't have the same experience that others do. And so I recognize my own limitations. And I speak not for everyone. Rather, what I hope to do is to raise up some frameworks from some deep listening to my own experiences and listening to others who have brought resources to bear, so that we can place frameworks over our own understanding and over our own preaching and worship practices that are helpful. So just a bit of a brief disclaimer, I want to hold your experiences as holy as well. So if you, contribute through the chat bar, through questions later on, I do want to hold those and honor those experiences and stories as holy. It's just a way of just quickly saying that I don't know everything about this. There's no way that I can, even though I think I have some helpful things to bring to the front. So let me start with defining some terms, because not all of us come to thinking about this topic with the same frameworks in mind. So when we talk about infertility, we're talking about a biological condition characterized by a prolonged inability to conceive, or simply when a fertilized egg cannot be sustained in utero. So that situation, or different sets of situations, are roughly what we would call infertility. And then along with that, if we think about the term reproductive loss, it's sort of a larger blanket term that includes experiences of infertility, even if they're temporary. And we think about loss of fertility, we think about experiences of miscarriage, stillbirth, and other forms of pregnancy loss after conception. So reproductive loss gives us sort of a bigger umbrella to think about these things, perhaps not just infertility, but also even after conception, losses that come along with it. So that kind of gives us some orienting terms. And we can go ahead and move forward, Katie. So let me tell you a little bit about my story and how I came to talking about this. In the spring of 2006, my wife and I decided that it was our time to begin the process of building our family. And I'm getting ready to turn 40, so you can do the math on this. But like a lot of young professional couples at that time, we'd put off having children as we made our way, my way through seminary, as my wife made her way through graduate school and began the early stages of her teaching career. And in 2006, I was admitted to the PhD program at Vanderbilt. And we decided together that that was the time that we were going to begin trying to build our family. And not what turned out to be naively, we assumed that this would be easy because so many of our friends that we knew were having success. And so we just went along with that assumption. And lo and behold, about a year passed with no results whatsoever. At about 6 months, we started to buy books because we thought we were doing something wrong and we thought we could get some insight. So we bought books, we read in order to, as you can tell, hopefully yield the result that we wanted. So we started charting basal body temperatures. We relentlessly timed and charted ovulation cycles. Those of you who've read and know about this can imagine the sorts of things that we did. And so after the year had passed, we had nothing to show for it, as it were, and we began the process of fertility testing, which turned out to be a very cold experience. I often tell the story of my first time in a doctor's office, and they had taken all my information. They gave me a bracelet, and then the nurse came to the back of the waiting room and opened up the door and had the clipboard and called my name. And then I felt as if I was kind of like a piece of cattle because they were checking the bracelet to make sure that my number matched what they had in their records. And so eventually we switched doctors. We didn't continue on with that doctor. And my wife certainly had the more invasive experiences with a lot of frequent blood tests, sonograms, and very invasive, very uncomfortable. And ultimately, it was determined that she and I were largely in what they called the unexplained infertility category. Now, at this time, 2006, this was not something that anyone we knew, at least that it had never made that plain to us. We didn't know anybody who had gone through this. And so we didn't have any wise counsel on how to proceed. And we had to start making decisions about our course of action. And so we resolved to go through as much and as many fertility treatments as we could afford until we felt like we'd exhausted our options. Now, for us, this was a pretty indefinite line, but it had some definite bounds because I was a doctoral student, not working full time, and married to a public school teacher. So there were definite financial limits for us. And so ultimately we had 3 different types of treatment, which all escalated in cost, in invasiveness, and in preparation. And the first 2 led up to ultimately to an IVF treatment. And it's fair to say that those treatments were grueling for certainly for my spouse in greater degrees than they were for me. But I was the one who gave her injections with needles that felt like they were pieces of PVC pipe. And we went through that in order to create the right kind of environment and to make the timing just right as clinically as we could. And so in our IVF, we were only able to do that because of some unexpected and most welcome financial generosity from family members. And in the IVF, we ended up yielding only 2 embryos, neither of which classified as strong candidates for growth or implantation. And as it came to pass, neither of them implanted and neither of them grew. So I share that story just to sort of orient you to where I'm coming from and my experience. For us, there was never any miscarriage because the pregnancy never occurred. And so I recognize that some things we'll talk about tonight I've not had experience in. But I still think and recognize that I have had loss in this area. My spouse has had loss, and I think we can place some helpful frames around that. So, Katie, if you can kind of go ahead, one more slide. So, a few things to note about our story. The first is just along with this experience. We began to talk about cycles of hope and despair. So you can imagine every month doing what you needed to do to make the environment right. So we'd hope, and to get our hopes up. And when that month came by, and no pregnancy occurred, immediately down into despair. Imagine this for the better part of 2, almost 3 years, if not more. So cycles of hope and despair. I think that's one frame that we can place around this experience. Another, at this time, in the year 2007, was the appearance of the movies Knocked Up and Juno, if you remember those movies. Knocked Up, as you see the image there, was the story of these 2 young people who spend one night together, and a pregnancy occurs, and they figure out how to do life together. And so that and Juno, these kind of media experiences for us influenced how we felt about ourselves and the experiences that we were having. It was so easy for these movie characters, right, to achieve pregnancy, but not for us, right? So what we saw reflected in media was not our reality. Along this time, too, was really the advent of social media. And all of our friends were beginning to make their pregnancy announcements on Facebook. And so what did it mean for us to have this digital network and to sort of experience other people's lives from afar and to make sense of our lives and the experiences we were having when others were having joyous experiences and we were having things that we didn't want to share with anybody else? Although that's changed, I think, and changing over the past few years as people begin to bring those experiences more into the public. I was also a PhD student in preaching and worship, and I was faithfully occupying a pew each week. And as a late 20-something, early 30-something, this was difficult because everywhere that my spouse and I visited, think we were 20-something, 30-something year olds, we were like the great unicorns of church experience walking into a church, a mainline church. Everywhere we visited, people were so excited to see us because we were young people. And after they asked our names, the very first question you might imagine that they asked was, do you have any kids? Do you have any kids? And so imagine this, how this made us feel, that we were sort of only good assets to a congregation for a limited sort of quantity of experience. So we were a very hot commodity, but only in so much as we were able to bring children to the table. Along with that, I grew up in the church, and my dad was an elder, and my mom played piano and organ and ran VBS for the churches we were a part of. And so I was an insider, and I was always able to locate myself within the confines of the church and within the narratives of Scripture. But it was during this time when we were having these experiences during a summer ordinary time cycle where I heard again the stories of Abram and Sarai. And then in Advent, the stories of the conception of John the Baptist and ultimately Jesus. And I began to have this experience that now I was beginning to not be able to identify with these stories and these characters. And in the preaching and in the worship that I experienced with those scriptures, nowhere were these stories and characters, these pillars of the faith, nowhere were these stories related or translated into the experiences I was having. The difficulties of conception were not acknowledged, nor were the real losses of fertility loss. So we engaged in some real grief and real loss, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. Along with that, our bodies weren't as dependable as we thought they were, and here we were in our late 20s, our early 30s, still quite young. And so we did some healthy grieving. We talked, we read, we prayed. We did some unhealthy grieving. We bought a flat screen TV that we probably shouldn't have. And we grieved the loss of a church community that had been dependable for us for so long before. So um, it's easy to sort of relate my story, but why does this broader topic matter? And so, Katie, if you could go forward one more. Yeah. So, why does this matter? The statistics there are pretty plain. So 10 to 15% of people trying to get pregnant experience infertility. And approximately a third of those stem from problems related to women, a third from men, and a third from both. And these are in heterosexual relationships. And these are from statistics from the CDC. And 1 in 5 pregnancies in miscarriage. So, not just for the unicorn young people that walk into the congregation on Sunday morning, but for the generations of people who've come before, the people who are sitting in the pews, they're harboring for a lot of them, memories of these losses, these experiences of pain and grief and loss. They affect the people in our worshiping communities, whether that's young people or older people. And so to acknowledge these, to deal with these in real ways in preaching and worship is a big deal. So this matters a lot. Another reason why this matters. One of the fundamental purposes of the community of faith is to help people name and frame and interpret and make meaning out of human experience through the lens of Christian faith. Part of being church is interpreting life experience through faith. And so we want to move people from the theological, what we call embedded theology, that sort of everyday theology that's sort of running around within them, to a more, what's called a deliberative theology, a theology that has taken account and has reasoned well and has wrestled and comes out on the other side with more than just the operating theologies of the everyday. And I think preaching and worship does this. So another reason why this matters. When we do that, when we begin to make interpretive moves, when we help people frame their experience, especially when we think about experiences of suffering, we want to be a community that leads toward healing. And you might stop there and say, well, wait a minute. We're not a community that can do that. But I want to say there's a difference between healing and cure. And it's fundamental that we make that difference. So I'm not talking about laying hands on people and saying, look, when you leave this place, you're gonna get pregnant, or this pregnancy that you have will absolutely come to term. What we want to say is that healing is different from cure. So on the one hand, and theologian Kathy Black talks about disabilities. And she says that cure would be the elimination of a disability, elimination of a sickness, elimination of a physical malady. Healing, on the other hand, she says, entails the process of, quote, making it through the hard times and realizing the, quote, new possibilities that are present for us. So healing is being able to make it through and being able to name and discover new possibilities on the other side of whatever difficulty that we're going through. That's healing. And it's definitely not cure, which would be the physical resolution. So this matters because I think we can do that. So, and especially in our disciples tradition, we talk about a lot about healing, wholeness. And with that, we would talk about sort of shalom, peace, health, and completeness. So some three interrelated goals as it relates to preaching and worship as pastoral care. Coming out of that, so we want to name and interpret experiences of infertility and reproductive loss faithfully. And I would add to that as well with sensitivity, right? We don't want to just charge out of the gate and start dropping these terms and trudging up people's experiences like a bull in a china shop. So we want to name and interpret their experiences of infertility and reproductive loss faithfully. The second thing that we want to do is that we want to form communities of care. Form communities of care. What do I mean by that? Well, in the best congregations that I know, it's not just the pastor that does all the work of caring. It's the people in the pews who see themselves as a community, who share a mutuality in ministry, who connect in relationships with one another and become responsible for one another in their care. That they consider themselves to be hospitable. That is to say that I can bring all of me to the preaching and to the worship and to our being community with one another, and that's okay, right? And that we recognize that we are responsible for the care and compassion of one another, and that leads to our care and compassion for the world at large. We recognize that we're intertwined. And then the third is a little bit more complex. So to create intentional and effective pastoral communication. What in the world do I mean by that? Well, if you think about it rhetorically, every component of our congregational life communicates the boundaries, right? Makes what we might call a public or a community. So with the words that we use, the images that we set up, the stories that we tell of our entire community, whether that's preaching, whether that's worship, whether that's greeting at the door, the newsletter, the budget, we're going to create a kind of community. We're going to create a kind of public. And that public will include or it will exclude, right? And so we need to be careful and considerate about what kinds of communities we're making, right? And we want to be leading toward a restoring and restored public. And knowing that you are part of a restored and restoring public can be incredibly powerful to be affirmed by someone else bringing your experience into the worship, into preaching, into worship, into a worship service. So we as faith leaders want to be strategic. We want to be intentional. And that's not limited to preaching, as I said. Acknowledging that our congregations are made up of people who have thousands and thousands of different experiences. And I don't want us to leave the experiences of infertility and reproductive loss at the door. I want us to be creating communication, pastoral communication, that people can find themselves on the inside, not as I did on the outside. So let me pause here because I haven't asked for any comments or questions at this point. So do you have any comments or need some clarity? And I'll just sort of pause for a second and wait for anything to pop up in the chat box. All right, I'll keep my eye on it, but I'll keep us moving forward. So I want to talk about some pitfalls. What are the biblical and theological complexities associated with reproductive loss? The first and the primary one, and perhaps the most pernicious, would be silence. Silence. So Katie, if you can move us forward. Think about this question. What is it like, or what would it be like? And this relates to the experience I related of being an outsider. What would it be like to never hear a word about a significant part of your identity or your life experience in Christian worship? One of the things that I like to quote is sort of a paraphrase from the book Worship as Theology by Don Salyers. Don Salyers says this about worship. He says that Christian worship is where the divine ethos meets human pathos. And when I take that into congregations where I'm talking about worship and I talk to lay people about worship, I sort of reinvent that for folks. And I say, what Don Salyers is saying is that where worship is where all of who God is meets all of who we are. And I think that captures well what I hope out of preaching and worship that faithfully and sensitively addresses reproductive loss. That we are able at some point to locate our life experience within the realm of the story of Christian existence and within the worshiping community. To be fair, this question can be asked by lots and lots of different kinds of groups, and they have been asked by lots of different kinds of people with lots of different experiences. And so I'm kind of tagging this one along with that. We want preaching and worship to address the whole person and the widest varieties of human experience. So we're going to have to overcome our silence and our hesitancies in talking about this. The second pitfall would be what the biblical scholar Phyllis Tribble has long ago called texts of terror. And she talks about texts of terror as, and talking about biblical texts here, scriptures that seem to wound us, right? That we have to wrestle with, and that we might come away, to borrow the biblical language, with a limp, right? And so among those texts of terror are all of these miracle birth stories that we get in the scriptures. And there are plenty of them. Abram and Sarai and Isaac and Rebekah and Jacob and Leah and Rachel. In Judges 13, Manoah's wife, Hannah and Elkanah, who eventually have Samuel. In 2 Kings chapter 4, the Shunammite woman who's blessed with a son for her hospitality to Elisha. Psalm 113 that declares that God, quote, gives the barren woman a home, making her the joyous mother of children. And then our texts that come to us in this season with Elizabeth and Zechariah giving birth to John the Baptist, and Mary and Joseph to Jesus. As I said, sitting in the pews, I began to really question my relation to the God who worked miracle births for Elizabeth and Zechariah and Mary and Joseph, and the God who was not seeming to act in the same way for me and for us. And I think that's a question that might not be so foreign to other people. Right? So, miracle births.
Space to interject it, if that's okay. And that was, how did you and your spouse respond? Or maybe, and I'll kind of add to that, maybe what was the learning curve of your response when people would ask you, oh, like, so when are you having kids? How many kids do you have? And yeah, that, if you don't mind, talking about that in the middle of these texts of terror.
No, that's a great, yeah, thank you. So one of the ways we simply responded was just sort of with a not yet. You know, no, we don't have kids yet. You know, we hope to someday. So we kind of put it off. We didn't go into detail, especially with people that we didn't know very well. With family members, we would certainly go into a little bit more detail, depending on how close we were to them. But yeah, that's a great question. I don't know that there's a perfect response for that. It just depends on your comfort level, and how you think it's best for you to respond. So thank you for that question. This would relate, I think, to the next category in terms of texts of terror. And this complication of barrenness, the complication of barrenness. So the word barren, or in relation to people, is used 24 times in the biblical text, 19 times in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, and 5 times in the New Testament. Sometimes it's used in relation to a punishment for sin. And the Greek word for barren is stera, which you can hear sterile, right? Which describes a field that does not yield crops. And in fact, just a couple of weeks ago, I heard a sermon preached that I kept count, used the term barren 4 times in it. And it was describing it was a sermon on Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar, right? And I want to complicate that term, and maybe even say that when we read those texts that in our Bibles are translated barren, that we change the translation. Because what I want to say is that no life is barren, right? No life yields nothing, right? And so if we think about what contributions we make to the world, whether or not we have children, I think we need to complicate that word and maybe change it when we talk about the biblical text. The third pitfall in terms of texts of terror would be miscarriage. In Hosea chapter 9, verses 10 through 17, the prophet describes miscarriage as punishment for Israel's unfaithfulness. Now, is everybody who's had a miscarriage reading Hosea chapter 9 and thinking that that automatically translates to punishment for their unfaithfulness? I would say absolutely not. But I don't think that we can, many of us can get around the feeling, oh my gosh, have I done something wrong, right? Even if we have MDiv degrees or PhDs in theology, it's hard to get around some of that cultural theology that creeps its way onto us. So we've got to make sense of these texts and for ourselves and for our faith communities. And we have to unravel the questions of, does conceiving or bearing children have something to do with faith and faithfulness or unfaithfulness? Does it have something to do with divine promise and divine curse? We've got to unravel the questions surrounding, what do I have to do something differently than I'm doing now to obtain God's blessing? If children are thought to be a blessing from God, is there something deficient in me? Is God supposed to be intervening in a way that God is not intervening now? So these are the questions that come as a result of reading these biblical texts. They can be texts of terror for us. Also problematic are images of God, right? So the predominant imagery for God is God as father or mother, God as this sort of parent. These are the major metaphors that we use oftentimes. And these, as you well know, are metaphors that understand God as procreative. And God has no difficulty creating children, sons, daughters, for God's self. And we are made in the image of God. So these can be difficult images for us to hear, for us to say, for us to experience in worship. Serene Jones, in her wonderful little book called Trauma and Grace, has this sort of heart-wrenching story about her and her friend Wendy. And Wendy had just had a miscarriage from an 8-week pregnancy. And Serene Jones and her friend Wendy go to sort of perform this ritual. And it's raining outside, and they're doing this ritual in the rain. And she has this quote that just sort of wrenches my heart. She says, having spent years together in a women's group at our local church, we were accustomed to praying to God in the feminine. But today, lifting up prayers to Mother God seemed like a cruel joke, and we felt bereft as we struggled to find other theological images that might hold us in this moment. And so the question of how we image God matters. How is it that our imagery for God might limit God if we use only these images? How might these images of God ring hollow or incoherent for people who have experienced reproductive loss in some way? Just something I want to hold out there. Another would be the image of God as the giver of life. Now, it's part of the Nicene Creed, and I know if our attendees are disciples, they may not say the creed often, if at all, but it is part of the sort of large corpus of Christian confession. And if God is the one who indeed gives life, one of the questions, at least that I wrestled around with, is If God's the giver of life, why isn't God giving life to me as I expected God to? Right? So, why is God withholding? For some, why is God taking away? And wrestling around with the God who is supposed to give good things of those who ask, right? And then the final image would be that great image from Genesis. God is the one who tasks humanity to populate the earth. So what if you don't have the ability or the capacity or the experience to live into that divine command? For some of us, that can be a problematic way of walking through the world and worthy of paying attention to. So some further pitfalls, some theological themes, questions that need to be wrestled around with. Suffering, that sort of perennial question, but it applies here as well. Why does suffering occur? How can we make our way through it, right? Not a question I'm going to solve here in the 20 minutes we have left together, but an important one. The second one would be thinking about and interpreting the human body. Christine Culp, in her wonderful book called Vulnerability and Glory, a Theological Account, talks about and helps frame the body as vulnerable. And I don't think we too often accept that vulnerability. We live in a highly technological culture, right, where we try to put off the vulnerabilities of our body as much as we can. And so trying to make peace with that and trying to interpret the human body as indeed made in the image of God and yet vulnerable, right, subject to breakdown, is an important thing for us to wrestle around with. Serene Jones also talks about the body as a place where we lose control, where we might lose our future. And that was certainly true for me, those two categories. Others, she says, experience this sort of loss of bodily integrity or a rupture of self, and even the body as a space of death. So, important thing to hold on to, how is it that we interpret the human body and think about it in terms of its vulnerability? The third would be, or the next one would be the silence of God. When we're waiting for news and going through cycles of hope and despair, we're experiencing grief and loss, and deeply involved, at least for me, and I know for many others, in the practices of prayer. They can heighten questions that we have about the God we claim who is still speaking and intervening. An image I used in a sermon one time as I was talking about this experience was about ceiling fan prayers. Ceiling fan prayers. And what I mean by that is when we're going through this, there were many nights where I lay awake in bed, unable to sleep, and I would just watch the ceiling fan spin around and around. And there were times where it felt as if, as I was laying in the bed, praying these prayers and casting them up to God, that the ceiling fan was doing the intervening and spinning them out to the furthest reaches of space. And they were unable to find their way to God. And thus God was not able to respond to me. And for a lot of people, when I preached that image in that particular sermon, that was really impactful for a lot of people, as they said it, that they had cast their own ceiling fan prayers up to God and had been waiting for God to speak back and did not hear them. Not so much in an audible voice, of course, but in terms of life situations changing and moving. So let's move really quickly to talk about some specific theological goals for preaching and worship. So the first would be simply to reaffirm personhood in those who are experiencing this. To say, hey, you're not deficient. You are indeed fully human and fully made in the image of God. Another would be to express care and concern as a faith leader in a congregation without settling for easy answers and without passing off easy answers. Enough people will give those. easy answers. Another would be to be a pastoral presence and to help negotiate cycles of hope and despair. To be able to name moments of hope and despair in worship, whether that's through preaching, through ritual moments, or through different kinds of liturgy. Similarly, to help navigate, but not resolve, because you're not going to be able to do that. Experiences of grief and loss, to create a holding environment for lament. And then to help identify God's gifts and God's presence for people who are experiencing God's silence, for people who are experiencing God's absence in such a way, to be able to narrate that God is indeed present in some ways, to identify that for people, to point that out, and to suggest that, yes, even in these profound experiences of suffering and absence, that there are gifts along the way, and be able to identify that. Another would be to celebrate different constructions of family and those roles, aunt, uncle, special friend, without dismissing the loss or the potential loss of sort of hoped for family, to be able to celebrate different ways that we constitute and form family with one another. And then, of course, one that's what I think sort of one of the most pernicious is to counter what I call pop theology, to counter what I also call sovereignty myths about God. Those easy answers, right? Well, it's not God's will for you. It's not your time yet. All of these things were said to me and to my spouse. It's God's testing you, or God's teaching you something. The final one wasn't not God's punishment, but was something that I, had at least entertained internally. So to be able to set up theological systems and move people into ways of thinking about their life that operate in counter ways to these pop theologies can be really helpful. Another I would add that's not on the slides is to really think about how ritual functions. So ritual functions in some different ways. You can create new narratives, possibilities of transition. You can provide frameworks for interpretation and meaning. You can create community through rituals. So the big payoff here, how can we plan meaningful worship in Christmas and Advent in the face of reproductive loss? So I think that the real, if you take away nothing else, is just to remember that it can be hard for even the most faithful of people, if they're going through this, or if they have a memory and experience lodged in the back of their minds. It can be hard for people to show up in Advent or Christmas if they're going through these kinds of experiences of suffering. And so the smallest liturgical gestures can make a big difference in creating space for healing, community, and moving forward to the other side, whatever that might be. So just starting there, and a warning, don't leap into this without thinking it through. Right? I realize I'm going through a lot of material and doing it pretty quickly, but I want you to think it through in terms of your own theological constructions and how you can be sensitive to those who may be in your midst. So I've got three things I want to think about with you in terms of constructing worship, and they all sort of move on a trajectory, right? And a widening trajectory. So depending on your context, you may just want to think about starting small, right? One of the first things I suggest to people is, if you're leading worship or if you're preaching on a particular Sunday, the week before, leading up to it, I want you to go into your sacred space and stand in the pulpit or stand behind the table and just say the words out loud, right? If you don't have the experience of doing that. Say the word infertility. Say the word reproductive loss. Say miscarriage, right? And be present with the feelings that come up when you do that, and think about and pray about the others who will experience those words. I would say train your greeters. All right, greeters are connected to our worship experiences, and so instead of having them ask, well, do you have any children? Have them ask, well, is there anything you need before you enter the worship space? to make you more comfortable. Or restrooms are this way. If you need to know anything else about our worship space, please let me know, right? Can we, and then, so to think about, as we move more into worship, think about acknowledgement, right? Without singling out anybody. So in preaching, is there a way that I can acknowledge experiences of reproductive loss, of miscarriage, infertility, right? As a possible way of receiving a biblical text? Not all of us will sit and wonder at the story of Mary and Joseph and Jesus, right? Not all of us will sit in wonder and awe at the story of Elizabeth and Zechariah. So you might at least mention it in a sermon, or you might mention it in a call to worship or a pastoral prayer. You might simply add these little buzzwords to longer lists of difficult issues that people might be experiencing, right? Just to bring that up to a level of awareness and acknowledgement in a congregation. You might think about acknowledging it in a church bulletin or newsletter, and then sort of giving people a preview as connecting points to worship later on. So if you're feeling more comfortable, then you might dedicate an entire liturgical moment to exploring reproductive loss. So you might spend a whole entire sermon accounting for this interpretive lens, right? It would be a risky thing for you to do, perhaps, depending on your context, or you might feel more comfortable in that. It would certainly provide a lens that people don't often think about, right? You might dedicate a prayer station that would be that would exist through the Advent and Christmas season, and you might invite people to light a candle there, to confidentially write a prayer or a name. You might spend an entire pastoral prayer acknowledging the difficulty of anticipation in the Advent season, of hopes that don't arrive, right? You might create some sort of ritual, especially if there's a season in your congregation where there's a notable loss in your faith community, or an especially difficult pregnancy loss. You could create an entire liturgical moment with permission, of course. So if there are especially sensitive losses that you're aware of, do consider asking permission or giving warning beforehand. And that's going to depend on the size and the constitution of your faith community. Then, if you're ready for more, right? If you're ready for more, you might think about dedicating an entire service to this. So some of you might be familiar with what are called longest night services or Blue Christmas services, which are services of lament, services for grief and for mourning of all types. And they come right before Christmas. My congregation where I attend now is having theirs on the 23rd. And there are tons and tons and tons of resources that you can, great resources that you can access. I've got a tab up on my browser right now that's just Blue Christmas Worship. You put that into your search bar, you're going to find a ton of great resources. I would especially lift up the United Methodist Church resources and the Young Clergywomen International resources. If you're Disciples, Disciples Net Church has a fully online videotaped worship service that you could follow along and even send to somebody. Consider that October 15th is National Pregnancy and Infant Loss Remembrance Day, and we're not too far from that. So you might consider ways that you could adapt, and there's a website called october15th.com that has some resources on there that you could transport over to an entire worship service dedicated to this. You could even get crazy, right, and do this service ecumenically. Call together a bunch of the clergy that are in your locale, get them together, dedicate an entire service to this, and would present a really wonderful moment of pastoral care and ecumenical relationships for the community in which you find yourself. So those are just some openings. toward meaningful worship in Christmas and Advent. We have a few minutes left, so let me point you to some resources. I first wrote my book, and it's now in the second edition. In 2015, I started writing. Katie, go back one more. And since then, a bunch of resources have come out that are really helpful. I would point you to Elizabeth Evans Hagen's book, Birthed, which is from Chalice Press. Serene Jones's book, Trauma and Grace, which I mentioned before. Tabitha Johnson, whose Disciples edited a book called Still a Mother, that's about infant loss and miscarriage. Two websites, projectpomegranate.org and october15th.com are really great websites. And then Resolve is the National Infertility Association. And you might think about your congregation hosting a group, a support group. And then my book, which is called Tending the Tree of Life, which is available through all your book selling outlets online. I commend it to you. It's got resources in there, liturgical resources in the back, in the appendix, and some sermon resources in there as well. With that, I think we've got a few minutes left to questions. And so I've squeezed in a ton of stuff, and apologize, I guess, for the pace. This is my first time in this format, but glad to take any comments and questions.
The pace was great. Thank you very much. We did have one more question that appeared in the questions below, which is going back to the images of God. Do you have any alternative images of God that you may have found helpful other than the giver of life, mother, father, the ones that we identified that are problematic? And how to help identify God's gift and presence for someone who can't see or feel it. So those are two questions. Let's go with the first one first. Do you have any alternative images of God that were? And if others have alternate ones, please put them in the chat box so we can all see.
Yeah. So great question. Thank you. So alternative image. I think. Of God, God as rock or fortress was helpful for me. As God as that which can support me and sustain me in trying times. I think also, going to sort of the second person of the Trinity, thinking about Jesus as co-sufferer, someone who came and experienced human life, even if he didn't experience human life in this way. But someone who suffers alongside humanity was very important for me.
I would also offer the God as the Quaker concept of Jesus as friend. I don't know that there's a lot of biblical support for that, but it's an image that I really, when I don't want to feel hierarchical, that I hold on to.
Yeah, I think that's great. It's certainly, from the book of John, the Gospel of John, is an image that comes to us, right? And then how do you identify God's gifts and presence for someone who can't see it or feel it? I think that's a very contextual question, right? It's certainly not giving easy answers, pat answers that, just wait and God's going to make this better, right? I think that's the wrong way to go. But what are the gifts that you can identify, right, without diminishing the sense of loss? Right. To say that I know things that are hard, but look around and identify how is it that you do see God present? Are there sort of cracks in the seams, right? Maybe it's a fantastic faith community, right? Maybe it's a wonderful friendship. Maybe it's meaningful work. Maybe it's opportunities for service. Right, that's hard, right? To identify for other people what the gifts may be, but just to venture some stabs at it, I think can be a helpful practice. For me, that was the third part of the question. What worked for me, and it was to see my life and my work. And the network of relationships that I had as incredibly meaningful and not at all limiting on the fruitfulness, right? Going against that barrenness, right? The fruitfulness of my life. So great question. Thank you.
Wonderful. If there's others, please feel free to type them in. Rich, your reference of the unicorns of the church in your 20s resonated so much with me because I remember in my 20s I was visiting a lot of churches and people sort of clawed at me, like yeah, like I could be some savior. I don't know. Give them a bunch of children or something. It was, and I never went back to those churches. And the church that didn't do that is the one that I joined and kind of led me on my path. So, such a welcoming presence that they had and valued me for me. And I love your idea of being able to train greeters and deacons to be able to share in that.
Yeah, when I bring that up, most people go like, oh, I never really thought about it like that before, right? But that's a huge part of connecting people to our worshiping communities. And so if we can start just at that simple point of entry for people, right? And considering that a part of the worship experience and not as something extra, right? I think we make a lot of headway if we can do that. Just by the simple thing of saying, this kind of saying might be off-putting to people, right? Is there a way that we can be more inclusive with our
Yes, language? I love it. Well, I think I don't see any other questions, and others may come up. And so if others' questions do come up for people, I don't know if Rich is okay with you reaching out to him, but do reach out to me at Katie K Valentine at dsf.edu. I have too many emails. K Valentine at dsf.edu. We would value anyone's input watching this, and if this is meaningful for you, if you would like to see an extended version of this, where we could offer this in a sort of a more extended format, maybe over the course of a week or two, and really dive into liturgy making and creating and some specific trainings. And if that's a direction that would be helpful for clergy, for elders, for anyone else in church leadership, let us know so that we can move in that direction. And I want to thank Rich very much for his time, for joining us. It is late now on the East Coast, so we're very appreciative. And I do see one more comment. Let me take a quick look. Yeah, there's thanks from the audience members for sharing your story, and I echo that too. It was very meaningful to hear. So I'm sure that this will be helpful and meaningful for people as we move through this season. Thank you, everyone. Let me extend blessings to everyone as they go forward and as they're doing worship planning and able to fold this aspect of meaning making into their Decembers and Januaries and beyond. Thank you, everyone.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.